Okay, we should be live. So welcome to meeting 61. First item on the agenda is reviewing previous decisions made in action items. So reviewing meeting 60 notes. I guess I'll just quickly breeze through this. The decisions made, decision 60.1, go with a 6-month time frame for hard forks for now. That was discussed on the last call. Any comments on that? $60.2, move EIP 1057 into the accepted category. 1057 is ProgPow. That was discussed on the last call. Decision 60.3, remove EIP 655 for now, as it's a superset of 1829. That was the ED 25519 precompile, and I believe 1829 is Remco's general elliptic curve linear combination EIP. Actions required. Have folks been reading through all these at the start of each of these meetings? I don't want to waste time on this if that hasn't been the case previously.
Yeah, they've been reviewed with zero to some level of discussion, so I think it's good to review them.
Okay, I'll just keep going then. We just have a few of these. Action 58.1, cat herders to look at updating EIP1, status work in progress. Pooja, do we have any new news on that?
I have a PR
Tim.
open for this, so I guess yeah.
Great.
If anyone wants to give feedback on it, you can, and that's it.
Tim, feel free to throw that URL for that PR here into Zoom or into the Gitter. Okay, great, thank you. 60.1, review time frame for hard forks in June to refresh memories. Hard forks in June. What does that mean exactly?
It means that in June.
Sorry, we should write, okay.
Re-examine timing.
Thank you, Boris. My English parsing is not up to scratch this morning. I need more coffee as well. That makes sense. So it's not June yet, so I think we can keep going. 60.2, Dano to add 9-month out hard fork kickoff to time frames. Dano, is Dano on the call?
Yeah, it'll be done in about 5 minutes.
Excellent, thank you. And feel free to also, well, I guess I can post the link for that. That's an Ethereum Magician's thread, right? Okay, 60.3, EIP 615 decision discussion at next meeting. So this is Greg, Brooklyn, Pavel, and Christian, subroutines and static jumps. I think that is on the agenda for today's meeting already. Boris, is that accurate?
Don't think so.
Do we want to add that do we want to discuss that briefly right now, or should we add that as a separate bullet point for this meeting?
I'm here if we want to.
I'll add it to the agenda for this meeting. Let's keep moving through the action items. Glad to hear that Greg and Boris, you're both here to discuss it. 60.4, Dano to add list of conditions for implementation and push request EIP, I think that's pull request, EIP 1057 into the hard fork meta 1679. So EIP 1057 is ProgPow. Is that now, Dano, in 1679? Just checking.
Yeah, and I put on there to say that it is the security audit above and beyond the standard security audit requirements for the typical EIP, and that it should be considered before inclusion. I didn't list any explicit reasons because we don't know what the audit's going to come back. And there's going to be, of course, some discussion on what constitutes a clean audit and what's not a clean audit. So that's basically a discussion we need to have when the audit comes back.
Great. I see that here under proposed EIPs under 1679, which is indeed the Istanbul meta. I posted the link for that in Gitter as well, and there's that caveat that you mentioned a moment ago, Dano. That's very helpful. Thank you.
Should I raise my hand before I talk? I don't know. Sorry.
We haven't done that in the past, Rick. Feel free to jump in.
Okay, so yeah, I mean, in addition to the code audit, is there discussions around simulations and all this other stuff, and testnet deployments and all of that stuff with ProgPow as well? Is that all like in the same? Are we thinking about all those things at the same time?
I think that's a separate item in the sense that I just added to the comments for this thing is that there is no point of contact for testing, testnet coordination, or anything other than Dimitri's retestf work. So I am proposing that there needs to be at least one human who coordinates and cares about all of those things.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Hello, I do.
Let's cover it when we get to that in the agenda. So Lane, can you just add the agenda, testing, testnets, and the path to that for Istanbul?
Yes, I'm updating the agenda right now to add 615 as well as that. Okay, EIP 615, and you said testing, testnets, and the road to Istanbul. I like that. That sounds very poetic. Okay, great. Continuing to move through previous action items. 60.5, Martin Swendy to confirm that EIP 1884 has been merged into the hard fork meta. 1884 is ENS interface discovery. Do we have Martin? No.
No, it is repricing of opcodes.
Okay, so there's, oh, that's 1844. The link is broken. Okay, so it's 1884. I'll fix that link.
It's there.
And it is in the meta. Okay, great. Okay, 60.6, Martin and Alex Bergzasi to confirm whether EIP 689 needs to be implemented. 689 is address collision of contract addresses.
Yeah, so my take is that we can skip it because 684 is already implemented. They're basically the same thing. Axec, do you agree?
I hadn't had the time to look at it, but I think you mentioned that create 2 is in conflict with it.
No, not in conflict. I mentioned that create 2 necessitated, well, a long time ago we decided on EIP 684, I think 684, and that's roughly the same thing as 689. So I don't think we need 689. Or wasn't it 684? Was it something else?
Do we need to discuss this further? Should I add it to the agenda, or are we comfortable with your determination just now, Martin?
So it's 684, but it's not published as an EIP. It's an old style issue. So it's not, yeah, it's not, it's from August 11, 2017.
I would suggest we
know.
take it offline, but the end result should be that if we decide that 689 is not useful anymore, then it should be moved from draft to rejected.
Okay, I'm gonna move on to the last one here if you guys are comfortable with that. So 60.7, parity to comment on libraries for precompiles. Just scrolling through this thread, I don't see any comment from parity here yet. Do we have any parity folks on the call?
Yeah, it's Phil here, but yeah, I don't have any comment right now. Get something for the next call.
Okay, great. We'll leave that as an action item for this call as well. Thank you.
Just to phrase it, Phil, I think the question is the Parity Ethereum client team comfortable with using libraries for shared precompiles? Or would they only want to have native implementations in their core client? And ping me if you have questions about that. I think I've said it correctly.
Okay, we'll do. We'll follow up.
Thank you, Phil. Thank you, Boris. Very helpful. Cool. All right, that concludes actions from the last call. So next on the agenda is roadmap. Do we want to review? I guess we should, because we're coming up now very close to the first deadline. We have a hard deadline 1 week from today, May 17, to accept proposals for Istanbul. Anyone opposed, or anyone think this deadline needs to be changed? Speak up now.
It's
Well,
specific.
I said that this deadline is not really, it shouldn't really be there, but it's only my personal opinion because, as I said many times before, that just putting something as a placeholder there doesn't really help too much because the EIP is ready when it's ready. So I don't know if I just write a bunch of EIPs and put it there, and that will basically waste a lot of time to be in a discussion in court of calls. Like people will try to go through them every single time and then just, but if it's not specified, like I think it's just a bit of a waste of time. But that's my personal view on this.
So I would like to defend the notion of consideration deadline. One of the things we're moving towards, which is different, is the train-based model of releases, where your EIP is ready when your EIP is ready and it gets on the next train, and those trains leave the station every 6 months. And if we're going to do that, we need to have some sort of a roadmap that says you really need to be ready by this point, or you're going to miss the train. And that's really what this is. It's not strictly if you miss this by 1 minute, then you're going to get 10% off your grade, you're going to fail the final exam type deadline. But it is something that people should be working towards if they're trying to make this train, to try and make it ready, or they need to make a gut check call that this EIP is not going to be ready for the release in 5 months.
Well, I understand this. The intention is clear to me, but I do not think that EIP is the correct thing to be putting in, because as far as I understand, the EIP is the specification of the change, and the specification of the change, from my point of view, cannot be produced in a high quality until a lot of other work has been done.
Alexi, let me just cut you off there. So I understand that you have a particular hang up about not using an EIP until it's perfect. So in part, this is signaling to understand and plan. So I personally, if you put an EPUB that says Alexi will fill in later with high quality, but I intend to get it into Istanbul, that would be awesome from a signaling perspective. Is that ideal if like 30 different people all put in things that basically said the same thing? Not useful, but it's what we've got today. And I think that if you want to bring in an EIP past the deadline, it will be considered because that's what ACD can do. But in the meantime, we'd like to push anyone else not named Alexi to get their EIPs in. Is that a fair way of saying that?
Well, yes, but I think it's maybe I'm just too hung up on this, but we will probably need to redefine what we really want. Do we want the IPs, or just we want like a couple of lines of saying that this is what I think should be happening?
Yeah, so I think we're talking about three different things that are currently being addressed with one document, and we need to decide how many documents we want to make to address these three things. One is a quality specification, which I think Alexi wants, and is something I would appreciate. EIPs do not provide that today. The EIPs as they exist today are sort of a high-level proposal, which is fine, but then there's also this third thing that has come up, which is the intention to get your change into the next hard fork. And so those are three different things. I don't want to blow up the complexity, but I think that we at least need the intention of inclusion as a statement made somewhere, and we need a formal spec made somewhere, and we need these other things in between.
Yes.
Right. So
yes,
I'm open to changing the names of things or making new things or whatever, but those three parts of the process still need to be covered. Whether we cover them in 2 documents or 3 documents, we probably shouldn't be covering them in one document that gets revised 3 times. I think that's a little confusing.
The purpose of the last call process was to get a fairly high level of quality in the EIPs. Obviously, as clients implement, problems will be found and changes will need to be made. But the purpose of that process is to say, this thing looks pretty good and let's go. And I don't, right now we don't have that requirement, but getting it in would probably be a good idea.
Zach, can you mute?
If you asked me a question, I couldn't hear you.
Oh, Zach just had some background noise.
Okay. Any additional comments on roadmap or the possibility for multiple EIP tracks? I know Alexei posted a comment here. Alexei, do you want to expand on that? Oh, sorry, that was Alex. Do you want to expand on your comment here, Alex, about not having different categories?
Yeah, sure. It was just reflection to what Boris said, that I don't think it sends a nice signal to the outside, that there are different categories of people trying to propose stuff. Even if it was made as a joke, I think we just have to ensure that people don't mistake it.
I will not be prevented from joking.
But I do agree that
I hear you, Alex. So I personally would prefer if Alexei could signal which EIPs or categories of EIPs he thinks he can get ready for Istanbul. I think that would be a super useful signal. And I don't care if he uses a smoke signal, but it would be useful unless we're going to change our process in the next 7 days.
Yeah, so I can do that. I can describe roughly what I would like to get prepared, but I can't write the EIP because from my understanding of EIP, it has to be a formal specification. So if you agree that EIP is basically not a formal specification, I'm going to do this. Or tell me what other things I need to produce, which is not an EIP.
So Alex, you and I did updates to 233. What if we say EIP XXX Alexei 2BD, but here's the name of it. So then at least we have a record in the same spot. So in 1679, we would actually have that listed.
My understanding of the process was that the first deadline lists EIPs which are in draft mode, and we don't really have a concrete specification what draft mode means, even for core EIPs. But I would assume that draft mode still means that it may not be fully specified. It has a general idea, and it is likely to improve throughout the process. So probably the draft mode doesn't mean that it is fully formally specified yet, but it has the intention that it will be. And with the first deadline, my assumption was that whatever is proposed by the first deadline is the list of EIPs which are going to be deliberated on. And with very few exceptions, new EIPs should not be possible to be proposed because that may just lengthen out the process.
In fact, they can start being proposed for the next hard fork.
Yeah, I would suggest not to be very kind of, I mean, I understand that people want to have these very firm procedures, but I would like to ask, what is the purpose of having this list defined before the 17th of May? Is it this list that we're going to keep discussing for the next, like, say, 4 months? Is that the purpose?
Well, Alexa, it does help if there's a list where we know, okay, so these are the things that I should focus on and look into and try to find flaws with and join working groups or whatever to weed out the details. Even if it isn't finished, it's a list of, you know, good things that if I want to help out and dive in, these are the things that I should look into. So I
Okay,
think
so
that's
that's
perfect.
really good to know. Thank you. Yeah.
And maybe it's worth highlighting on the client side, it kind of puts an upper bound on the changes we have to plan for. Like there won't be more than all of these EAPs that make it into the hard fork, and that's valuable to know.
Yeah, just to echo that, that's the whole point, right? I mean, we need to figure out what code is going to go. I mean, I'm sorry, it sounds pedantic, but we have to figure out what code actually goes into the fork, and we need to know that some time in advance. And if we just say, okay, here's the gate, and you know, if you miss the gate, you're not getting into this fork, you'll get into the next fork. I think that simplifies everything overall.
It'll be generally very good to have this deadline. And at the same time, the only comment I had before was I was worried why Alexei's changes were not included, knowing that he was planning for free hard forks to deliver 1.x. And it would be enough if Alexei just includes there's some suggestion on which of the EIPs from his list will be there. So 17th would be great to see the upper bound, as it was mentioned before.
Okay, so I can make the very rough list of things that I would like to be included, but there won't be a EIPs essentially in my understanding. So that's fine.
So I think I suggested it's okay if it's not EIPs, but Alexei, I think Alex is correct, is that likely what would be good is if you created draft EAPs that indicate what those are, and then those can be PR'd into 1679. So draft EAP means that it's basically filled out. You can have a bunch of sections that are TBD, but we have a number assigned and we know the name of it and basically a rough abstract that says, this is this one, so we know what we're talking about.
Okay.
It sounds like we have rough consensus on a couple of things. So obviously there's still a little bit of a question here around what exactly is an EIP and exactly how well formed does it have to be by which deadline. But to try to kind of tie a bow on this, it sounds like we are agreeing that there is value in these deadlines, number one. Number two, that this first deadline should serve as an upper bound, right? So the idea here is like this is the maximum number of changes that might go into a subsequent hard fork into Istanbul in this case. But of course, not everything that is proposed by that deadline will make it necessarily into the hard fork. And furthermore, that as of this particular deadline, 7 days from today, these EIPs may still be in draft form. They're not expected necessarily to be thorough and complete. And of course, they're not expected to have implementations ready because there's 2 months following that until July, I believe, for that to happen. Anyone opposed to that summary? Otherwise, we can keep moving, I think.
No, it's fine. I'd like to volunteer, but I'm too busy as an EIP editor. Alex is an EIP editor. Can someone volunteer to just help very busy Alexei with the mechanics of just what an EIP is actually very well defined. And as someone just said, get them going, get an abstract, get them in. So we have numbers to refer to for what Alexei wants to do, because it's so important that it gets done. It helps a lot to have numbers to point at and say these things. Is that
Alexei, I'm fine to help you with the mechanics of it. I think on the other side, we just need people or poking people in ACD who can merge them.
It's okay. I think it's not a problem merging. Basically my kind of resistance was mostly about the formedness of the EIP, because my previous assumption was that EIP is supposed to be a formal spec, and then I wasn't prepared to provide a formal spec. So if that is relaxed, then I'm fine with that.
Alexei, are you happy with the following statement? An EIP draft is not a formal spec, but at the time when it's merged/accepted, it must be a formal spec. Does that help square the circle at all?
I'm not sure. I don't have time to think about it yet. So yeah, I will need to think about that.
I guess the goal with the EIPs is that they're going to be a very high quality specification for each of the changes, but I don't think that can be said about all the past EIPs which have been merged. There's a big variance between quality across them.
Yes, I know, but this is where basically I wanted to get out of this broken window kind of thing, is where, okay, we had the bad EIPs before, and then therefore we should keep doing this. So my idea was that let's start doing things in a good way, but obviously lots of the process is still going into the sort of old way. And so if we decide that we are going to relax this for now, then yes, I'm okay with that.
No, Alexei, the EIP process has been made solid by we editors for a while now. And to just put a draft in the system, it only needs to meet the form of the draft. Then there's a long process of getting the draft into the formal specification quality that you mentioned. We just need something at the beginning of the pipeline, the very beginning. It only has to meet the form. There's a program which will merge it automatically if there's no problem.
I think we're probably on the same page with respect to drafts, and Alexei has offered to create those placeholder EIPs. Boris has kindly offered to help him with that process.
Yeah.
Let's keep moving.
Good.
Thank you, Greg.
Can I add one final addition? I think the list of proposed EIPs kind of just state the scope of changes, but they don't necessarily have the final list of EIP numbers. But by that I mean maybe some of the even current proposals maybe will be split into multiple EIPs, and the same could apply to state rent related EIPs. Maybe it is enough to have a single state rent related EIP merged by the 17th, which defines the scope of changes. And maybe throughout the process of defining those properly in EIPs, we can end up with multiple EIPs. And I think that should be fine as long as we have at least one which defines the scope roughly.
Alex, are you volunteering to huddle with Alexei later and help him just get this going?
Well, actually, Greg, I think I'm okay. So I didn't have a problem of actually writing those things. I'm absolutely fine with that.
Great.
So that's,
Okay.
thank you very much. So.
Great. On we go.
All right, thanks, folks, and Alex, thank you for adding that commentary. This is clearly the first time we've done this with a hard fork, so let's kind of see how it goes. And I think there's definitely scope to learn from this process and figure out, exactly what role EIPs are and whether they can be split, et cetera. What the scope needs to be. The next item on the agenda is EIPs. Do we want to review the list of EIPs currently scheduled for Istanbul? Are there any more EIPs to add? I'm just browsing through the comments here in the agenda to see if I missed any. So I believe the canonical list of EIPs is in EIP 1679. Is that correct? Scheduled for Istanbul?
Yeah. So if you want to get a view, basically, so 615 is still something that we'd like to get in. So those are the ones that are already fully in. The wiki link there that Trenton has just posted have an extended list of other ones that people are like, yes, we're going to get this ready, and PR them in as well. And Trenton and I have been teaming up on keeping the wiki up to date so that we can get even more of a view on the train of other EIPs that may still be proposed.
Excellent.
One to pay attention to is EIP 1965, which is waiting on editor approval to be put in. There is some debate as to how the EIP 1344 and the one I just mentioned should be implemented. And the author of that EIP 1965 is trying to get that in, is trying to get the attention of people on Ethereum magicians. So there is some contention on some of the EIPs in this right now.
Thank
so
you.
that was just to state that is that there's contention with EIP 1344 and essentially an opposing EIP.
Yes, and that's not listed on the list in 1679 right now because the first EIP has been merged.
Good to know. Okay. Are there any, I don't see any in the comments here for the agenda for today. Are there any additional EIPs either already on the agenda or not on the, already in 1679 or not in 1679 that people want to discuss right now? Blake 2B was brought up actually. My understanding of the status of Blake 2B is Virgil reached out, actually Hudson reached out to Zuko, and there's definitely, Zcash would obviously like to see this as well, but they're looking for a champion, and Virgil has also offered some funding, and Gitcoin has offered some funding, but unless anyone has heard otherwise, I'm not aware that this is currently being worked on. And therefore is not going to make it into Istanbul unless that changes in the next 7 days.
So there's another kind of EIP which is not listed, but it's there's a working group going on this one. It's the generalized elliptic curve precompile, I think, and I think I want to make sure that I will make sure that it will be included. So essentially, that's a generalization of the previous one, which is 1889 or something like this.
Is it 1829? I just posted the link.
Yeah. No.
Alexei, that is waiting on Remco to finish his PR, which proposes it for 1679.
Oh, so he's going to do that?
Well, he did a PR, but it is out of sync, and he wasn't responding.
Okay, we can.
But the intention is there, so I think we definitely
sort that. And then also that is also extended now to the because there was a to-do in this EIP about the modulus. So the original EIP was saying that the modulus will be less than 2 to the power 256, which means that some of the larger modulus would not be supported. Most importantly, BLS 12381, which is used in the beacon chain. But now there's work on the even further extended variant, which actually will have a modulus up to the power 50 or 512, or even like 1024. So this is probably going to be extended in the IP or something like that. So.
As a second note, I think there are probably over 5, maybe up to 10 draft EIPs which haven't been merged yet. They are still as a pull request, and I'm seeing that people want to propose them as part of the hard fork. So maybe the editors have to help a bit more, or maybe we have to allow merging the proposed list without the draft being merged. But I'm not sure what's the best approach, because I think we have some predefined rules what quality, like basic quality an EIP should have at the time it is merged as a draft. Before that, it only exists as a pull request. And some of these proposals may not be up to the quality requirements of being merged as a draft. And we have said that only those which are merged as a draft and show up on the EIPs.Ethereum org website, only those can make it into the 1679 list. So probably this is a question we need to answer, whether this is a good approach or we should change it.
Well, but this is what already starts kind of coming back to what I was saying, is that what is the quality? So we just decided that it needs to be formatted properly, and that's it. And now we're talking about the quality.
Yeah, even the formatting is off in some of those.
Just because it makes this deadline doesn't mean it's going to be included as well. This is the first gateway. If you don't make this, you're going to be on the next boat. So we still need to vet and make sure that they're implementable.
Yeah, the next big challenge will be, I kind of expect that we will end up with probably a list of like 15 EIPs proposed by the looks of it by end of next week. And the big challenge will be how to actually discuss those 15 and how to reduce that set of 15 into a more manageable set.
Well, this is why I was asking what is the purpose of having this list. So it's not the purpose of this list to keep discussing all these 15 things every single time. Only when something is actually happened, then you should be discussing them, because otherwise we're going to be spending the entire time of just going through the lists and going through the same list. It will be super boring as well.
So yes, so that is, like we've said, the gate thing a couple of times. So the next thing that people need to do is get things into an accepted state. So they need to sign up to an all core devs, say, I would like to review EIP XXX and propose it for acceptance. That is the next step. If people don't get it through acceptance, all of this also essentially relies on champions to keep pushing it. So we're actively trying to weed out the things that people aren't going to work on. It's not arbitrary.
Thanks, Boris. Okay, that's that's great. I think we've talked this topic to death. It's obviously a very important topic, and I think that we should continue conversation on the Fellowship of Ethereum Magicians forum and maybe on future Core Devs calls as well. Let's keep moving. So the next agenda item is Alexei's blog post, which I think came out just a day or two ago, on changing processes in ETH1X. Alexei, would you like to just briefly share this? I'm going to step away from the keyboard for about 60 seconds while you do that.
Okay, so I think I'm not going to read it out for you, because you can just read. It's an agenda. There's a link to the blog post. And so I wasn't actually planning to write it, but then I realized that what was happening in my head about like what I think the Ethereum 1x process should be was just in my head, and other people think otherwise. And I realized that after listening to one of these what are they called, ETH community calls, when they decided or proposed, I would say, that to drop the 1x and the Ethereum 1x name, and the argumentation was that, oh, that's just it's just a list of items on the roadmap, and why should it be having this name? So it's just Ethereum. But to me, it was more than just a list of items. It's actually the attempt to change the process. And I described it in the blog post, so you can read it. The biggest thing is that it's not something that I premeditated like from the start. It's actually something which sort of organically fell out of what we are trying to do. So for example, from the work, and tried to organize the working groups around the certain changes. And then the next question was, who is going to pay for this work? And then another question was like, I realized that a lot of people who were coming and trying to do the work, they're already doing something else. And we have a very limited pool of people who actually think they can work on stuff. And so then I started to think, well, if they're going to work in parallel, like how are they going to get things in? Because we have a few bottlenecks in the current process. And for example, the testing is a huge bottleneck, as we repeated many times. So this bottleneck needs to be opened up. We also have some sort of a bottleneck that in the past, that most of the prototyping was actually done by the three, usually one of the three implementation teams. And that's also a bottleneck, because they were historically quite busy with the optimization of the clients, remember, between the Byzantium and Constantinople. So it was kind of unrealistic to expect them to also do implement tons of EIPs. So we want to remove, I think we want to remove these at least these two bottlenecks. So the ones which is the bottleneck on the client implementation teams, and the bottleneck on the testing. so therefore, basically, just push this idea of the working groups working in parallel, getting the proposals to a high quality, and basically making the process also much more inclusive by instead of waiting for somebody to pick up the change, just like if you can form the working group, just start working on it, and then once you get some good quality stuff, then you can just push it in. Yeah, so I haven't covered like test nets and stuff like this because it also requires a lot of description, and I also didn't even go into EIP process because for me it's still the EIP process is probably like something if you want to kind of really confuse somebody, you just basically start talking about the EIP process. So that's why I wanted to avoid most of that, and I just showed to people from my point of view how these things actually work and not how they work on paper. So yeah, so I propose that if people, I'm interested to see what you think about this and whether it's realistic or not. And I want to make it happen, but I understand that it might not. And so yeah.
Thanks, Alexei. Go ahead, Boris.
So, Alexei, I think it's great. We discussed a bunch of this stuff live in Berlin, and I think it's great to have this to point to and be documented. I think the ETHUB call, one of the things that was happening there is that there's a group of people there that want to help tell the story of Ethereum. And so I think that's where the context of some of this stuff comes from. I'm happy to basically have other people help tell the story of what's going on. And hopefully people can look at the blog post that you've written and take that in and help us as a community tell this story better. The one point that I will make is that if you haven't already, there's the concept of the Osborne effect, where basically it was a PC in England where they had a current version that was selling really well, and then they announced a new version, and sales on the current version totally dropped off and killed the company. And that is relevant context for exactly what we're working on here. I don't know how to fix it, other than I think part of it is absolutely that we need to improve our process, but the other half that I'm just gonna like basically call for help for again is please help us tell the story of how Ethereum is evolving.
And so thank you, Boris. And actually another thing I wanted to say is that when we were at Stanford in January, so one of the things I was trying to propose, which I don't think kind of worked, is that essentially I was trying to propose the monopoly on the changes in the Ethereum. But so essentially say, okay, so we're going to only just do like really, really critical changes, and everything else basically has to just go away. And because we're just trying to fix the chain so it doesn't really break down. And I realized that, you know, this doesn't really work. People want more changes. So once you allow one change, people want more changes. And so then naturally it started to shape up into the process, which will basically just increase the bandwidth for all kind of changes that people want to put in. And so that's why I think there were some comments about, I think from Frederick, who was in Stanford. He was saying, oh, the actual meaning of Ethereum 1x really changed since, let's say, the beginning of the year. And a lot of this change was happening in a couple of people's heads, not in like, we weren't really talking about these kind of changes. So I hope that now it's a bit more in the open. So it was my kind of hubris to try to actually presume that everybody is following me on this mental journey. But actually I realized, no, this is not, like, everybody's still thinking about what we said in January or what we said in December, and they haven't really moved on. So yeah, so it was my kind of my mistake that I assumed that everybody's moving at the same kind of speed.
Yes, and we have a ton of other stuff to do, like testing if we expect any of this to get in.
Thanks, Alexei. For folks who haven't read Alexei's most recent post, please check it out. I think it does tell an important part of that story, and I feel like I say this after every agenda item, but like we have a lot more to discuss, so let's continue that conversation in other places. To keep moving through the agenda, I did just make a couple of updates, so please refresh if you're looking at it, just things that had been missed previously in the comments. The next item is working group updates. Alexei or anyone else, do you have updates to share on the ETH1X working groups?
Yes, I think I will give you the update on the state rent working group, and I would let, if somebody else wants to do update on others, please do that. So on state rent, basically, I'm currently still trying to test what we call now the semi-stateless client approach, which is basically the evolution of the stateless client, whereas each block is accompanied by this block proof, which allows to execute the block without any access to the state. But now we realize that the penalty of the block proofs is quite large. So on average, it's going to be about 300 kilobytes per, actually 1 megabyte per of block proof per block as it stands now. And then if we just do it for the contract storage, it will be about 300 kilobytes. But it's possible to reduce this by essentially making the stateless client slightly more stateful. So, and then you can sort of by setting how stateful you want to be, you can actually reduce that block proof size further and further. So my task at the moment is to try to figure out what is the sweet spot, how much stateful we want to be, and how much of the block proof is going to reduce. And so the general idea is that if you have a peer-to-peer network like in Ethereum, and so each peer would define what their statefulness level would be, like that means like how many block proofs essentially they would in aggregate that would store. Let's say that somebody decides that they were going to store 1024 previous block proofs in aggregated format. So that means that if something has been accessed within the last 1024 blocks, or something has been created within these blocks, you don't need the proofs for that anymore because you have seen that already. So only give me the new stuff which hasn't been accessed or changed in these blocks. And so that dramatically, well, hopefully the data will show that dramatically reduces the overhead on the bandwidth. But also it means that the peers who have a bigger statefulness, let's say that you have a real big peer with lots of memory, that they would say, I would keep 16,000 blocks. And they would provide so let's say that this peer is surrounded by the smaller peers that can only, they say, I only want to store 256 blocks. Then the big peer would actually be able to generate the proofs for the smaller peers, which is going to be larger. So this is what I'm trying to trial at the moment, so that the data structure, which allows you to flexibly to basically generate the proof of any level of statefulness, so that the peers essentially agree with each other, like I'm going to be this stateful and I'm going to be that stateful, and depending on how what is the minimal statefulness, they will exchange different block proofs. So, but this is really tricky, and that I'm still debugging through some edge cases, but hopefully that would finish soon. And then then I will put this week I'll put the first EIPs into the state rent, which will essentially only deal with some accounting of the state, and also they will put the groundwork for introduction of some of the penalties for the state extension or for state expansion, like creation of the new accounts will become more expensive, and the creation of new storage items will become more expensive in the first hard fork, according to my plan. But the biggest change in the state rent proposal within the version 4 would be that it is very likely that we will not charge the rent proportionally to the size of the contract, but simply proportional to, let's say, to the code of contract. So that would mean that we will not have a vulnerability to the Dust Griffin attack, and we will use the semi-stateless client approach to sort of to mitigate this. Anyway, so that was my stuff, and if anybody else wants to talk about any other working groups, please do that.
Yeah, I'm happy to chime in with the the fee market stuff, transaction change stuff. I forget the name of the working group right now, but basically we're still talking with different groups looking for funding. We have some devs lined up, but we would like more. You know, we're constructing a budget, so you know, having a pool of devs available and interested in doing the work would help with that. It's a fairly complex change. I mean, it changes how transactions are priced. So obviously I have concerns with that around testing, deployment, you know, testnet deployment. I think that we should build a reference wallet to show wallet developers how to interact with these new transaction types effectively. There obviously needs to also be sort of technical requirement discussions. We need to actually nail down exactly which features and which parts of the proposal we're trying to implement exactly. There's a lot of it. It's pretty clear to me that it's not really possible to get it into Istanbul given the scope of the change. Yeah, I'm like I said, we're forming the group now, and I'm looking for developers who are interested.
Thanks, Rick. So relevant to you, and I think maybe to other ETH1X working groups as well, I'm just curious, is there any particular channel where you're communicating about both budgeting as well as need for additional developers? Is there like a wiki page or something where this is all laid out, where people can find it?
Yeah. So I'll just be frank. You know, in my professional experience, we don't, you know, solicit the public for these sorts of things. So I don't have any experience myself, nor does anyone in my staff really do that sort of thing. Oh, wow. Sorry, that was probably really loud. No one, myself, nor anyone in my staff does that sort of solicitation. If someone wants to, actually, that's not entirely true. We have one person who might be working on that in the future, but we're not quite there yet. I want to make sure that we have at least one commitment for funding before we, you know, start spending time going out and thrashing the bushes, so to speak.
To your meta question, Lane, so Alexi has been coordinating a bunch of proposals for the working groups to look at funding. And he's sort of quarterbacking that and keeping everyone updated. And at least on our case with the EVM evolution, we've been feeding Alexi updates. So we're working on 615 to the level that we can and intend to merge it. We can talk about that in the next section with that. You know, light work on coordinating in the sense that the precompiles, the big question related to EVM evolution is there will be certain things, including the Blake precompile, that may not need to be a precompile if we can get core clients EVM implementations tuned. We know that we either have the people who could do the work or can easily get some people to make time available if funding was available, but currently funding is not available.
Thank you, Boris. Thank you, Rick. Thanks, Alexei, for your working group updates. Any other ETH1X working group updates? Anyone else want to chime in before we move on?
Yeah, so I'm planning on putting together the testing working group, but I think I'm just going to hold off to talk about that for the testing section.
Cool. Thank you, Zach. All right. I'm going to move to the next agenda item. Do people want to meet in July? Boris, I believe this is yours.
Yeah. So I'm harping on this to try and do the timelining thing, because if we want to meet in July, or late July, that is now only kind of 10 weeks away. And I'd really like to give people at least 8 weeks heads up. And so just trying to get a basic temperature from the room. Should I gather together volunteers and plan to meet in July? Or do people want to get the work done just online?
So I have a couple questions. One, are we expecting a similar group? I mean, I guess I'm interested in meeting if we minimize travel distance for everyone and we sort of have a consistent group of people. Like I rather do it online, but if it's like, you know, the same 30 people with some, you know, plus minus or whatever, meeting in different parts of the, you know, again, to minimize travel distance for everyone, I'd be happy to do that.
Yeah, I mean, my assumption is that if the working groups and others need to coordinate, that this may be an opportunity to do that together, or people can meet separately. You know, I'll make sure to add the link actually again to the voting. There's the thread in Ethereum Magicians. So I'd really appreciate if everyone has a look and leaves a comment and just sort of yay or nays, like, nah, let's just be online. That's totally cool. Then I don't need to keep bringing it up. But if people do want to meet, we should decide soon.
Did you say it was going to be in Seattle? I think I saw that posted somewhere.
The two leading places are Seattle and somewhere in Canada.
I'm down for Seattle or Canada. God bless them.
Thank you, Boris. I posted the link to the Magician's thread in all the channels, and all due respect to Canada, New York is currently tied with Canada for second place, so please get your votes in if you haven't yet.
I mentioned it would be good if people didn't just give a preference, but also a possibility. You could prefer one, but if it's, I can go to one and I can't go to the other, that helps.
Yeah, we should do some sort of ranking or something.
It's not ranking. It's like, I prefer, it's not just that I prefer, I cannot go the week of the 29th. And other people probably have similar constraints. You know,
Thanks.
Do we need a DApp for this?
I was going to say we probably want to do quadratic voting. Maybe we should get Democracy Earth on it.
Oh, Jesus.
All right. Thank you, folks. Boris, thanks for putting that poll together. Again, the link is in all the channels. Take a look if you haven't. And Greg, to your point, I'm sure Boris will factor that into the math.
Leave a comment there.
We're a small enough group that I'm sure this can be done manually for now, but it would be fun to have that built in the future. Okay. Next item on the agenda is an item added here by David Murdoch on from Ganesh and mentioning a spec compliance issue in Geth. David, do you want to bring this up briefly?
Yeah, sure. So I'll link it here. So what this is an issue with Geth or Ganache or other clients maybe, where the either V and R and S, one of those be for JSON RPC returns, or Geth expects it to be a quantity, but the spec says it should be data. And so Ganache is compliant with the spec, which causes or testing against Ganache that's using Go Ethereum to crash their Go Ethereum instance. So I just wanted to figure out one way or another which way things should go there. If the spec should be updated, or maybe if this issue at Go Ethereum.
So if it's only Go Ethereum that does this, and I think they filed a PR against the Go Ethereum, I don't think it needs to be discussed on the recorded call.
Okay.
I think the spec does one thing, but V number is generally across most of the clients, I think, treated as the quantity. Because it's used the same ID.
So I guess the complexity here is that although the spec indeed says that R and S are just binary blobs, in reality they are actually numbers. So all three values are numbers. So I mean, I don't care honestly. We can go with either decision. We can fix it.
It's just that V is used for chain ID from the EIP that was defining the chain differentiation and signatures. We started using V as the chain ID number, so that's why it's treated differently.
Right. Yeah, and I'm fine with any way it goes. It's just we brought Ganache into compliance recently, and now there's issues stating that it doesn't work with Ethereum, and it's just a frustrating situation. So.
Yeah, so I guess the question is what we need to agree on is whether do we consider these numbers as binary blobs, or I mean, if most of the clients accept it as binary blobs, then I mean, we can change the behavior. That's not a problem.
Yeah, I mean, if someone can put down on a PR, yeah, parity does this, and get and the rest of the clients does this, and get this only one that does it the other way. Here's the PR to fix it. Then I'm sure it will be included.
I'll go ahead and check parity then. I'll update the issue with what I find.
So this brings up a meta question. If we're going to look and see what other clients do, what's the value of a spec?
Yep.
Or should the spec be brought in line with the clients?
So,
well, I guess you could. So that is why I was asking that instead of looking at the clients, we should maybe decide what the correct behavior should have been instead of what one or the other client is doing. So that's probably. I think we had this debate with Felix a while back, and he was the one who was saying that he doesn't really want to change it because all these three things are numbers. And then the question is, do you want to challenge the spec or not?
Well, one thing to keep in mind is parity may accept or handle the data both ways. Like Ganache doesn't care if it's a data for its quantity RPC type. We'll fix it internally. But Geth is much more strict on that. I don't know what parity does there, but
AKA Postel's law.
Yes.
Yeah, so we deliberately are strict on everything because, at least based on my experience, if you tend to accept various different things, then eventually you end up in a similar case like JavaScript, where hey, this is a Boolean, let's convert it to an array and add 25 to it or something. So you have these weird things if you are too permissive. Now maybe this isn't that case, but yeah.
Sorry, guys. I think there's something that I've suggested in the agenda and something that came up with I would explain like later. But I think this JSON, that sort of the JSON RPC has kind of grown organically, as far as I understand. And in the beginning, there was no standard, and then now it's actually quite hard to force the standard upon the clients. So what I suggest, I only started thinking about it. If we want to start to create the proper standard, maybe the way to do it is to actually do the non-JSON standard and then put JSON as an adapter in it, because we also realize that the JSON is not really optimal format for everything, and in lots of cases it's very suboptimal. So I just wanted to start thinking about this, but any immediate thoughts on that?
So regarding that, that's actually an interesting question. If we consider that we also have RLP encoding, how do we RLP encode these RSV values? Because if we include them as integers, then it might actually make more sense to keep the JSON spec in line with the consensus spec.
Well, I don't know how we encode them in RLP, but I think they're just numbers, which is basically kind of string of bytes. But what I basically suggesting is that we have essentially kind of half-spec'd the network protocol, which is the E63, which is basically RLP based, and then we have the light client one, And so what I'm basically thinking is that why don't we just create the similar one with their similar kind of flavor of commands, which could query the data out to the node, and that would be the standardized way to get data out, like about transactions, blocks, what have you, like storage, and then we put the essentially layer of JSON on top of that. And so if people don't want the JSON, they won't need, so it will be like an adapter, like a module kind of thing. And we keep the standard really tight on the ROP one.
Well, yeah, but that's essentially what you're proposing is to create yet another interface, which is just a huge pain.
So I think there's a couple of things going on. So we're in the midst of having components that need specs spinning out and having their own repos. I know the EEA is interested in this. Oasis is looking at potentially helping spec JSON RPC. The other thing that I have to say is that there's many more stakeholders around the JSON RPC layer, like wallet providers and other middleware. So I think we should encourage those people to form around it and create a spec and work with clients, including how to do vendor extensions or client extensions. As far as I know, those efforts are ongoing. So that is happening right now. And they're going to do PRs against clients if there's issues that are found. And the other thing is, this is a layer that doesn't break consensus for the most part. And it means there's no reason to tie it to hard forks, so that anyone who wants to work on this can work on it and improve it without any blockers.
Yes, let's move on from this one.
There's some coordination factors in the sense that if clients randomly change JSON RPC at different times, then the higher level middleware gets into a bunch of issues. But that's also something that I think those stakeholders can figure out.
Yeah, I mean, I'm in favor for the stakeholders sort of deciding it amongst themselves, but I would like to get an EIP or something, I don't know quite what to call it, to unify the spec as one of these middleware providers. The difference between the clients is like really frustrating because a lot of it's needless. So if we could someone start some sort of project to unify that, it'd be appreciated. I'm happy to do that for certain things like PIP and LES, but not for everything.
So there's I'll add links to the meeting notes. There is an EAP for that already. The next step is ideally, just like dev P2P has been spun out into a separate repo, that the JSON RPC spec gets spun out into a separate repo, and people work on specifying it, and the EAP then references certain versions of the spec.
So just one more thought along those lines. I kind of like the idea, but one thing that I think the entire Ethereum ecosystem was missing since forever was actually a test case, a test suite that can actually test, that implement the proper RPC stuff and properly. And I know that at a certain point we did a few explorative things on Hive, on top of Hive, but basically we didn't really have the manpower to keep maintaining them. But I think if we could dream up and maintain a proper test suite for RPC, that would be the way to enforce that every client implements a proper RPC and see whether if somebody's wrong, then we can fix it immediately instead of, because currently it kind of boils down to random people like you guys opening an issue that, hey, this doesn't conform to parity, and oh shit, yes, it doesn't. And then there's just no form around it. So I think it would be really, really useful to spin it out into a separate repo and to actually put somebody behind it who can create the proper test suites.
Cool. All right. In the interest of time, let's keep moving. We'll add as an action item to come back to this topic in 1 or 2 meetings from now. So we'll also include the link to the EIP that Boris just shared, as well as there's an attempt at an RPC spec that Casey put together previously, which is EIP 217. We'll take it from there. Thank you.
Thanks.
All right. Next on the agenda is EIP 615. This was brought up on the last meeting. I'm just going to read what Brooklyn said on the last meeting on this topic. So EIP 615 is EIP subroutines and static jumps for EVM from Greg, Brooklyn, Pavel, and Chris. And on the last call, it was said that this was discussed in Berlin. Some concern was raised specifically about the complexity of a number of the opcodes, discussion about perhaps breaking them out into separate pieces, still hoping to get this into Istanbul. Brooklyn, Greg, et cetera, do you want to speak about this?
Yeah, so I think that pretty much still holds. I think the authors are pretty happy with how it stands right now and very much looking forward to pushing this forward into Istanbul. There's a couple, like literally one or two holdouts that are very unhappy with the number of changes in it. So there's still some discussion about pulling other things out into other EIPs, but really fundamentally this work does come as one chunk, and I think Greg may be able to speak to that even more. But yeah, we're very much at this point happy with how it stands and hoping to push forward for Istanbul.
Thanks, Brooke. Greg, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, the complexity thing keeps coming up, and the desire to split it up, and backwards compatibility. I've got one last idea that I think will probably take care of the backwards compatibility problem. That could be brought up somewhere else, but it's pretty much been ready to go for almost 2 years now, and I think recent discussions have hammered out what problems there were in the spec. So I don't see breaking it up as any help. It stands together as one piece. And when you go to implement it really doesn't take very much code. And once the core things are done, the little things people want to split out are just not that hard to implement once you have the core. So I don't see pushing, if you cut things out, you just push work onto the Solidity and other compiler authors. And when they start into that work, they'll probably wish we hadn't split those out.
Cool. So just to be explicit, I don't currently see this listed under the hard fork meta 1679. So are you guys still planning to PR that in there in the next week?
Yeah, we'll PR that in.
Great.
I think we were trying to figure out if we were going to do a last call in between, but we'll just PR it in and make sure that it's officially listed.
Great. All right. Thank you. Okay, we've got a couple more items left. So the next item is one that we added earlier, testing, testnets, and the road to Istanbul. Boris, I think you suggested this topic. Did you want to speak to this at all?
I left it in so that Zach could talk about it, in that I just keep asking who is pushing this along, since I know nothing about testing. Zach, are you going to volunteer as tribute?
Yeah. So we're working on the same testing initiatives with the EEA. I'm leading the testing working group there, so it doesn't really make sense that I'm trying to create a bridge between those two, like defining conformance tests and a bunch of that other stuff. So currently I'm drafting a roadmap and a list of requirements, including like pre and post hard fork testing. So I'd like anybody's coordination or collaboration on this from anybody who's interested or has any strong opinions on the matter. So I've coordinated with people like Dimitri and others who have been working on testing, and we had an initial call, and we're gonna set up another call. So on the last call, I talked about hiring a developer to help augment a lot of these, and I think I found a pretty good guy. So we're gonna push the ball on that. We also released our open source testing framework, so check that out. We're incorporating a lot of those tests into it. So another thing I need is I'd like input from each team. We need to identify who the testing lead is going to be, so we can all coordinate. And I think that we should have a kickoff call like next Thursday at around this time. And I'll share the link in the chat the day prior and like the day of. So please ping me if you'd like to coordinate on all of this stuff. And I'll post a summary and start a working group ring on Ethereum magicians, but yeah, that's about it.
Awesome. Thanks, Zach. Exciting to hear the testing moving forward. Okay, still on the topic
Questions about the test nets. Is this the call where we coordinate some of the named test nets like Ropsten and Gorley and Coven, or is that out of scope of this call?
I think that would be appropriate. So I've reached out to the Gorley guys. I had a call with them 2 weeks ago. So I'm going to try to get them on the call as well, so we could cover those talks too. So in terms of test nets, like another goal we have at the EA is to launch a test net by Q4, but I don't think it really makes sense to try to duplicate all these efforts. I think that it would be better if we had a bridge between the EA and the public Ethereum community. It just doesn't make sense. So that's what I'm going to try to navigate on our behalf. So.
Just looking at the proposed agenda for Istanbul, it lists August 14 as our current target date for upgrading a testnet, Ropsten, Gurley, or an ad hoc testnet.
Can you?
Rick, couldn't hear you just now. What was that?
Oh, sorry. Could you just speak?
His internet hates us.
Apparently. Rick, you want to try one more time? Or do you want to send a text message here, Rick?
Speak a little bit more.
Yeah.
Oh, is my connection has it gotten really bad?
I hear you now. Go ahead.
Sorry about that. What sort of testnet is EEA looking to deploy?
So they want to launch a testnet to ensure conformance to the EEA spec, but from my understanding, the EEA spec is really going to be pretty much the same thing as the public testnet spec, except they have an additional privacy layer. So from the privacy layer down, everything is the same. It's the same exact system. So I think that it would be great if we collaborated on that and pooled all of our resources rather than just segmenting all this work. Because if we're working on testing here, and we're working on testing at the EEA, and we're working on testing somewhere else and somewhere else, I think we should just have a more coordinated effort so we're not duplicating our work and we're making the most of the time spent, as well as everyone's efforts.
What connection points do we have with the EA, and what kind of work do they do that we would benefit from?
What kind of work? Well, so personally, I think that the biggest benefit from the EEA is that they're old dudes who have been doing this for a really long time. And I think that it would be great to understand what their processes are and standardizing a lot of the things that we use currently on the internet. Like, for instance, Charles Neville is the guy that led a lot of standardization for different things. I think that those processes and understanding how to approach those from a more enterprise perspective will allow us to create a more coherent and cohesive community and ensure the continued adoption of this technology we're building together.
Yeah, I definitely second that. So my next question is, when you talk about the privacy layer, is this just quorum or is it something else?
It's not just quorum. It's anybody who would like to participate and conform to the EEA spec.
Okay, I'm sorry. Yeah, okay, I'm sorry. So right now, is that quorum, or like what is when you say the privacy layer on top, how is that being, like, what's the actual code difference? How is that being realized as code?
So the difference between what quorum does in terms of privacy, so quorum just has geth, and then they have like an enclave, which acts as like somewhat of an intermediary between these 2 points. It's the similar architecture to Pantheon's what Pantheon's doing. So Dano could probably speak more on that. But
I'm sorry. I'm just trying to get to. I'm sorry because I'm asking this sort of backwards. I'm just trying to figure out what is the actual, like, if you were to build a test net that met this spec versus a normal geth test net, I assume there's some additional code.
Right. Yeah. So, right. So the additional code is generally some sort of privacy enclave. Other than that, some things that I noticed at the face-to-face meeting are people are talking about adding different opcodes, and I think that that's really kind of like not a very good thing to do, because if they implement something that's supposed to be specific to the EEA, then they're going to have to fork that and maintain that, which is just a huge pain. And I think that everything can be done much more effectively, and there should be a lot more coordination and collaboration between all these different groups who are working on the exact same system.
Guys, sorry to cut you off. We're getting very close to the 90-minute mark here. This is important and interesting, but I think we can probably move some of the substance of this conversation to another channel, like the magicians. So thank you for sharing that, Zach.
Yeah.
Really, appreciate your point about more collaboration with EEA. I think that's an interesting question. I just want to make sure we save a couple minutes here for testing updates. Martin, do you have anything to share on testing, especially regarding Istanbul EIPs?
No.
Oh, that was easy.
I have something to share about testing. So let's see here.
Yeah, go for it. Thanks, Alexei.
Okay, so yeah, I've been talking to Dmitry for quite a lot for last week, and I think he's not available at the moment, but he will come back. So what we're trying to do is that essentially is a part of my blog post. I was talking about that the testing is definitely a bottleneck, and one of the reasons is that it's only like the Aleph is the only implementation which currently allows generation of these consensus tests, and obviously that's not good. You should be able to generate consensus tests out of any reference implementation. So Dmitry has been working on this thing called retesttest, which is basically the JSON. It talks the JSON RPC to the client, and it tries to generate those tests. And at the moment, it does work only on Aleph, and not all the tests work. So I was trying to figure out whether we can do it in Go Ethereum, for example, and I've been working on this. And this is where I sort of started to stumble upon lots of things about non-standard JSON, and actually JSON being a really bad format for this anyway, because, for example, if you do it over IPC, then you cannot predict how long the message is. And I know that Go Ethereum deals with that, but for example, Aleph does not. And there's lots of stuff, and that's why I started to think about not using JSON on the standard layer or something like this. But I'm getting through this, and so I just wanted to comment to the other bits about potentially bringing some stuff from EEA or anything like this. So after kind of observing for a lot of this for a long time, I would say that if we want something to be used for testing, it either has to be like a super robust and high quality, like let's say that AWS or Google Cloud, or it has to be absolutely everything open source, because we have to have ability for anybody to run this stuff. So if it requires some kind of whatever, something as a service, but it's not very robust, and it's not a go. It's no go. Despite how much you want to collaborate, if you don't have everything kind of at your disposal, it doesn't really work. So that was my comment.
Thanks, Alexei. Are there any sort of action items on the basis of this? Or just informational?
So there might be more action items. So basically, at the moment, I'm trying to figure out how difficult this is to essentially to integrate retested into the Go Ethereum, and there are some unexpected issues that I'm hoping to figure out. But once we've done this exercise, we probably will spin out some work for other clients, because they will get more of an idea like how hard it is. So at the moment, I think there's kind of not really many action items, but we'll see.
Great, thank you.
Pantheon likes retesttest, and we'll be looking into it, though we haven't done any implementation yet.
Cool, good to know. Thanks, Dano. All right, that's the full agenda, unless there are any client updates or EWASM or research updates that were not included here in the agenda. Does anyone have any updates they want to share from their end?
I do have one, well, it's not really a client update, just a satellite update, that I think about 1 week ago, the Rinkeby testnet was upgraded to the St. Petersburg fork. Essentially, the reason it wasn't updated along with Constantinople is because we rolled out Constantinople half a year ago, and 3 months before St. Petersburg was actually spec'd out. So now we actually did update Rinkeby to that. And I did see that a lot of people have not yet updated their Rinkeby nodes. So just a public shout out that you might want to update, otherwise your node is just hanging there, stuck in the network. So please update people. That's it.
Thank you, Peter.
Oh, Lane, sorry, I had another quite little sort of update, but it's I'm gonna do it very quickly, like in less than a minute, if it's okay.
Go for it. Yep.
So essentially, this is what I mentioned in the agenda. So I'm gonna try to prepare like a little workshop for the DAFCON in Berlin, which will be on the 21st, 23rd of August. And essentially, the idea is to try to teach people how to become core developers, to basically to remove this kind of the mantle of dark arts and trying to figure out what does it take to become one, obviously with some prerequisites. It's a super experimental, and I probably will be looking out for some help. And I think the first workshop will be probably based on Go Ethereum and some sort of testing infrastructure. And I think Dmitry will be helping me as well. So, but I will be like, I probably will be reaching to some of the Go Ethereum team to help me. But, I hope that people like this idea.
Thanks, Alexei. I like the idea a lot. We definitely need more core devs. I'm happy to help out with that as well.
Yeah, feel free to reach out if you need anything. We can also help a lot with, for example, spinning up testnets via Puppet, or if you need anything extra that's missing, I'm sure it can be arranged.
Cool, that's very good. Thank you very much.
All right, thanks everyone. I think that's all we've got for today. So enjoy the rest of your Fridays and have a great weekend, and see you back here in 2 weeks.
Bye-bye. Have a nice weekend.